Hi, in this video I want to talk to you about groups and teams in organizations, and I'm going to take a systems perspective. First off, let's talk about the difference between groups and teams. And in the work context, there may be some distinctions that are useful for us to note. So, a work group is a collection or two or more people who interact and share some interrelated task goals. Now, a work team is a type of work group, so it's a more specific definition. A team has three specific qualities. First, the actions of the individuals must be interdependent and coordinated. Next, each member must have a particular specified role. And finally, there must be common task goals and objectives. These characteristics of teams that we see might be also structural characteristics of groups, but they are more highly defined and salient within a work team. Now, when we take a systems perspective, it's good to kind of think about what that is. We've talked about taking an ecological perspective, and that's a similar type of idea here, is that we're going to consider groups within a context and think of them with features of time in mind. Think about the processes that they go through and the interrelated components that they consist of. Now, systems theory is very useful because it's an interdisciplinary theory. It's relevant to managing organizations, but it's also relevant to giving therapy to families or to thinking about how to promote sustainability. And we could think of biological system. The very basis of much of systems theory is in the discipline of biology. So it's a great theory to understand because it has such broad application. In this slide, you can see a particular application of systems theory from social psychology and the study of groups that Joseph McGrath employed back in 1965. Of course, the application of this model to work groups and teams also is very relevant and very interesting. And we can see that the inputs that we often think of are that organizational context, also the very task characteristics, whether they invoke a lot of coordination and communication in order to do them as prescribed that can affect the processes that groups engage in. Also, again, another input is that team composition, the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other attributes that the members have and bring to executing the processes that the group engages in to achieve their goals. Now, when we think about these processes, we can often think about terms like norms, informal rules that are created to aid in the smooth conduct of work. We can think about decision making in terms of processes we go through and perhaps pitfalls that we should avoid. Of course, communication is a central process. That interaction to perform the tasks and the unity and cohesion that is built are also often talked about as processes in terms of teams and organizations. Now, these groups exist to achieve certain outputs, performance, and productivity. But of course, other outputs also manifest themselves like attitudes. And there's also processes like innovation might be useful for us to manage in order to execute organizational strategy and optimize the learning that we get from the experiences we go through as a team. Now, I want to take a little bit of time to elaborate on some selected inputs, processes, and outputs. I think about organizational culture and leadership as very important aspects of an organizational context when it comes to how teams behave. The connection here, I think, is with values that are shared within the organization that form the culture. These lead to these unquestioned norms that we might bring with us into teams. These values are often reinforced through leadership. And leadership is oftentimes a bridge between a work group or a team and other parts of the organization. So, one of the great things about the systems perspective is it encourages us to look at the broader environment and its influence on the target that we're considering. And here we're thinking about groups and teams and organizations. And certainly the organizational culture and the leadership within that organization are very important inputs into the conduct of teams. We also have to think about task characteristics because different tasks demand different levels of coordination and communication and shared problem solving. And that requires then different types of interactions. And one key thing I think we have to think about here are the roles that people take in groups and teams. And that often is a key input defining the processes and outputs of the team. Now, roles are the parts that individuals play in the interaction of the group, and those may be defined formally or they may be more informal. There's a good amount of research that suggests that role clarity is a critical consideration for managing groups and teams, particularly in newly formed teams or new members to teams. So next, let's consider team processes. And in the earlier slide, I presented a lot of the traditional variables that are considered when we're looking at how to manage team processes. But I wanted you to consider an alternative perspective from Marx, Matthew, and Zuccaro present a very useful framework for managing groups and teams and organizations. Here we see different action processes that should be undertaken, such as monitoring progress towards goals and monitoring systems and backing each other up and coordinating the work through timing and sequencing of activity. Their framework also looks at interpersonal processes that go on in teams, such as conflict management. And so they talk about preemptive conflict management activities and reactive conflict management activities. Also, activities around managing emotions and motivating the team are part of their model. A third part of their framework are transition processes that are observed in group and team functioning in organizations. And so this involves formulating and planning around the mission, defining activity of the group. And we might do some retrospective and some prospective thinking around what has worked and what should our mission be in the future. Sometimes this is connected with a broader strategy formulation, such as strategy planning and planning out different what if scenarios for contingency planning. And sometimes it might even be reactive strategy when big changes occur, such as pandemics. Another thing groups and teams should be looking at during those transition periods are goals. Those are times where we identify what goals should be. Again, having connection to the strategic goals of the organization is often a good tactic to take. But we also have to think in a more near term fashion in terms of prioritization of activities and how that relates to the goals that we have. So, this perspective of Marx, Matthew, and Zuccaro is very temporal in nature. It considers the passing of time. And I think it's, in that sense, very useful for us and takes a different perspective than more traditional aspects of team process. Finally, I want us to consider team outputs. And of course, we can think of the traditional things like productivity and performance, or even things like attitudes that might be the product of the different processes that the group goes through. But I want us to look at a different variable here that might be related to innovation, and that is learning. And I think traditionally we think of learning at the individual level, that learning is a relatively permanent change in one's thoughts and feelings and behavior that result from experience. But we can, in when we think about groups and managing teams and organizations, think about learning at group and even organizational levels, and I think that can be very useful. And one way we do this in from a very applied perspective is through action learning groups. And Marquardt describes these, and action learning involves structuring the learning of groups around very applied, realistic activities. I've seen this applied within the execution of strategy within the organization, where you have project teams that are really changing the way the organization operates. And by reflecting and taking a very intentional approach to learning, we can perhaps create a learning organization whose work informs and feeds back and actually influences the culture of the organization. Another really interesting development, I think, is in the science of learning at the group level. And a concept here that has developed is transactive memory systems. This is basically taking a lot of the concepts of learning at the individual level and memory at the individual level, like recall and recognition and encoding and many of these other concepts, and thinking about how they might operate at the group level and how interaction might occur at a group, and we might in ways complement each other. The citation here is to a recent meta-analysis that I think would be very interesting if you want to explore more on this concept. So if you want to explore that citation or others, here are those references. Thank you for listening. Take care. Bye now.